Yeah, I think what I'll try to do here is one, connect, also try to connect maybe Scott's work to the discussions in Sri Lanka around transitional justice. So, as you're probably aware, in recent months, the South African delegation has been visiting Sri Lanka around the possibility of some kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think next week there's going to be a tour by the famous South African judge, Albie Sachs, in Sri Lanka to many cities talking about transitional justice. So clearly there is some discussion of it, and that's also part of the reason why I thought it would be useful to look at Scott's work. But at the same time, as Tushara said, what is the role of intellectual work as opposed to policy, right? And I think we are mainly talking about the form in terms of what are, for example, the background conditions in which transitional justice emerged, how do we understand it more broadly. So I think that's where I would like to see the discussion move, and that's what I will be mostly engaging with. By way of introduction, there is an excellent article by Paige Arthur titled "How Transitions Reshaped Human Rights: A Conceptual History of Transitional Justice," which I would strongly recommend for those of you trying to understand the history of transitional justice. And she traces transitional justice's emergence to the late 1980s, particularly after the end of the dictatorship in Argentina. I think we hear a lot about South Africa, but she traces it to the 1980s. But the 80s was also a time for her which, provided two problems for the emergence of transitional justice, right? If we are to do, say, a genealogy or trace why transitional justice as a field emerged at a certain point. One, human rights had already become a fairly widespread discourse, but how does human rights practically deal with these kinds of situations after a dictatorship or after a catastrophic conflict? Just dealing with individual human rights violations and so on becomes difficult. So how does human rights deal with it? And transitional justice became one kind of way forward for the human rights community. And the other is a question about a transition to democracy, right? Maybe a transition from dictatorship or a transition after a civil war to democracy. That's the kind of context in which transitional justice emerged. But at the same time, I think a lot of us know that the concept transition has a longer history, right? So even in Marxist works, for example, you would have heard of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, right? The transition as a kind of a temporal category that had been there much longer, or within also Marxist work, for example, the idea of the transition to socialism. So transition as such had existed, and it had a certain kind of, it was seen much more in structural terms, what kind of structural change was necessary, or some kind of a social evolutionary process. That's how transition was thought of. But with the emergence of transitional justice and then the way in which transitions has been talked about more recently, it has become much more of something much more prescriptive, maybe perhaps policy-oriented, something of expert knowledge, or even technocratic knowledge. So there's also a shift in the way what the concept transition means from the earlier kind of scholarship I was mentioning to the more recent kind of ways in which it's been deployed along with transitional justice. So Scott I'm only going to mainly work on the kind of conceptual bits in that chapter. I think Tushar has given kind of the narrative about the revolution in Grenada and so on. So I'm going to kind of engage a bit more kind of the concepts with which David Scott is working. For Scott, the way in which transitional justice emerges also is that that it is claimed that with conflicts there is a certain instability between law and justice. Right? It is as if that law and justice are on a parallel track. They are related to each other, but a conflict or a dictatorship or a revolution disrupts that relationship between law and justice. And the role of transitional justice is to put back law and justice on this track again. Right? That is one way in which transitional justice has been put forward. Of course, I don't think Scott agrees with that, nor do I. I mean, I don't think law and justice, even in non-conflict situations, are inherently stable as such. There's a certain instability to law. Many law scholars would also talk about the indeterminacy of law. But this is one claim that is made in the process of the need for a transitional justice process. Another kind of interesting point that Scott mentions here is, the kind of what transitional justice seeks to do is to subject both the perpetrator and the victim to technologies of truth and reconciliation. Right? There again, there's an assumed relationship between truth and reconciliation. That for reconciliation, you need truth, and moreover, even that truth may lead to, or perhaps even necessarily leads to reconciliation. It's a necessary condition for reconciliation. I think that is also something we can think about. If let's say Kumar murdered my brother, and I found that out, would I be then be ready to reconcile with him? Or would I want to kill him? I don't know, but there is this assumption of this relationship between truth and reconciliation that we hear in the context of transitional justice. But for Scott, it's also very political. Right? And it's necessarily political, though, as I mentioned earlier, it has become the realm of expert knowledge. It is seen as apolitical. It's just a process that a country that has gone through a conflict is not going to implement. But for Scott, there is something very political in the sense that it is about a transition away from illiberal rule to a liberal democracy. Right? From illiberal rule to liberal democracy, and here liberal democracy being the end point. It is, in kind of Francis Fukuyama's word, it is the end of history. It is the end that we have to reach to, and that is what the transition is about. And it's assumed that once you just need to set yourself on that path towards a liberal democracy, and that is all there is to be concerned about. And I think we will come back to this question of liberal democracy as an end, right? And what it leaves out, what it legitimizes, and so on. And for transitional justice, then for Scott, it seeks, it doesn't just seek to address individual crimes. It's not just the crimes of the Rajapaksas that it's trying to say, engage with. And when you say maybe a transitional process of Pinochet or the individual, right, or the generals under them. It is about trying to have a different political regime, right, and regime not in the sense of an individual, but a political regime, a democratic regime, a liberal democratic regime. So the emphasis is on how do we ensure a change of regime in the political sense, as opposed to dealing with individuals' crimes or dealing with individuals. In the process, you might have to deal with individuals. This is the Scott is kind of summarizing the claims of transitional justice. But to kind of take off from Scott, I want to also ask the question about what is legitimized along by setting us on this path of liberal democracy. What gets attached to it? And I would argue, or what doesn't get critiqued or what doesn't get questioned, I would say, in many places, and including in South Africa, and I would say, possibly the way in which the process is being thought about in Sri Lanka, and in most places is that maybe what gets attached but doesn't get critiqued is maybe something like neoliberalism, right? Of the kind of the economic regime that gets linked to the political regime. And what gets left out of this process of transitional justice is perhaps social justice, right? Or in the process of trying to legitimize liberal democracy, a kind of a vision of radical democracy gets left out, right? So I think maybe we can think more about that during the discussion. But I think to sum up, the important point here is the discussion about that it is about transitional justice is about either changing from liberal rule to liberal democracy. So it's mainly about a political regime, right? And there's very little discussion. The economic realm remains de-linked, separate from the kind of process that is seen. So you might have had a huge conflict. Of course, political institutions are devastated, but economic institutions are devastated. There's social devastation, but the emphasis is on how do you rebuild the political regime. And related to that, as I mentioned earlier, you can think of it as illiberal rule or authoritarianism. Right? There's this idea that there's one path between authoritarianism and democracy or liberal democracy. And even liberal democracy or democracy in that sense, it's seen as an end. Right? It is not seen as democracy is not seen as a site of struggle. It is not seen, once you get the legal conditions right, once you get the constitution right, you have democracy. It's not seen as something that is constantly unstable, right? And this is also what happened in, I think, the vision of also the transition in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union, right? It was assumed that there'll be a certain democratic change. So the idea of a kind of Putin type of authoritarianism was never part of the possibility of this discourse of transitional justice. And democracy is seen mainly as the realm of law and legality and constitutionalism. Right? Now, I would argue, borrowing from scholars like Geoff Ellie and so on, that the condition of democracy is much more related to social relations, social institutions, the role of trade unions, the role of social movements in ensuring certain democratic freedoms. But here it is all considered within the realm of legality and constitutionalism. And finally, maybe just some provocative thoughts, linking it to Sri Lanka. It's much more open. I'm also thinking out loud here. Transitional justice, even though it's seen as a domestic process, it is seen as a process within the nation state. It is very much an international discourse, right? And any international discourse has a relationship to the global order, right? to global hegemony. And I think that is what for me is interesting in reading Scott. Besides Grenada and what went on there being interesting in itself, I think as also Scott says, Grenada also speaks for the rest of the world, the kind of conditions that we find in our world, and it's from these very particular places that you also see the workings of the global order. And when we think of such international discourses, I think Sri Lanka has already been subject to a number of them, right? So not, and very much even in the recent past. So about 12, 15 years ago, we found that the discourse, for example, of conflict resolution, of peace and conflict had become very prominent here, and it arrived in some form in Sri Lanka. Or the discourse of failed states and the war on terror, right, was another discourse. These are all recent discourses. Or even more recently, what people have been grappling with, the discourse of war crimes, right? That these are international discourses that get developed, and they come and they become part of it. And it's very interesting how these political concepts suddenly, they emerge, they gain a life, and they become almost part of, the material social life as well. They are not just concepts that just remain there floating. They become part of our everyday language, almost, or everyday actions, even. So that's one thing I want you to think about as we think about, what I see as a moment when, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, what I'm seeing as, it has been kind of there, the transitional justice discourse in Sri Lanka, but with the change of regime in January, there is an increasing momentum of its arrival. And as we think about its arrival, why at this moment is one question. But also, what are its, what will be its consequences? How does it shape our politics? So it's not about, I'm not here trying to either tweak what it should be, should it be about reparations or not, or amnesty or prosecutions. Before that, I'm talking more much about the broader conditions in which this discourse has arrived. Or to take a step back, like 12 years ago, at the height of the Norwegian peace process, and when conflict resolution became very important, what was its consequence? Are we in any position now maybe to evaluate in retrospect the way in which it may be reified, two major actors, the Sri Lankan state and the Tigers, the LTTE, and claimed that it was going to bring about some kind of a resolution. But one argument could be that in fact further, right, polarized, strengthened, and also contributed to the kind of catastrophic end of the kind of conflict between the two actors. I mean, this is debatable, of course, but that is also a possibility. These discourses aren't neutral, so to speak. They become part of the body politic. And what I find interesting now about transitional justice is that it's also being critiqued from the right as well as the left, right? So, I would like to think of a critique of it from the left, of transitional justice, of its the kind of global hegemonic, the imperial conditions, as in the case of Grenada, which allowed for its, right, its both its emergence and its kind of workings. But there is also a critique of it from the right, as there has been of liberal thought as well, both from the left as well as the right. And what I find also interesting at the current moment is that both the Tamil nationalists and the Sinhala nationalists are also very wary of the arrival of transitional justice, because it is also seen maybe in some ways as a shift from the last 5 years, right, of the kind of war crimes discourse. It's a shift from Geneva, and maybe some of the international actors are also part of this shift, along with the shift of, or the change of regime in Sri Lanka. So these discourses are also managed to some extent by different actors, and different actors have different stakes and different interests in it. So I think I'll stop there. But now I think we should move into discussion. This is not a Q&A, right? It is really meant as a discussion, and I think both Tushara's thoughts and very helpful kind of contextualization of some of the concepts and so on is meant to kind of help us move into that discussion. So I think maybe what would be good is to get like a series of comments, questions posed at each other, posed at us, before even either of us want to respond. The floor is open.